What's up, Joe? What's up, everybody? The NCAA receives over $1 billion a year in exchange for the broadcast rights to March Madness. Yet the men's basketball players who are largely responsible for generating this cash windfall are limited to receiving the value of their student-athlete scholarship, which averages roughly $38,000 a year. Robert Romano, assistant professor of sport management at St. John's University, contends not only that D1 men's basketball players should be paid, but he also provides a detailed analysis that explains just how much the players should receive and how the money should be distributed. It's a great conversation, man, and we're going to get right into it on Sports 360. Joining me today on Sports 360 is Professor Robert Romano. Professor Romano is the Assistant Professor of Sports Management at St. John's University in New York, and he is also the author of an award-winning paper that discusses the value of a Division I basketball player. Professor Romano joins us today to talk about his paper and all the related issues. Professor Romano, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm doing great, and thank you for taking some time to join us here on Sports 360 to talk about your paper and more importantly, the topic, the value of a Division I men's basketball player. And first of all, congratulations on winning the award for best paper. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that in terms of the award-winning paper that you wrote and give us a little background on that.
Sure. The paper is entitled "The Value of a Division I Men's Basketball Player: Is the Student-Athlete Scholarship Fair Value for athletic participation at this high level?" And I get an award, Best Paper Award, from the Global Business Research Symposium. And the Global Business Research Symposium is an organization that holds an annual conference. This year we happened to be in Valencia, Spain. So about 2 months before the conference, my assistant came and said, "Hey, you may want to think about this, submitting your paper to this conference." So I did, and lo and behold, they accepted it. And then I got to fly to Valencia. I got to present it to a panel of academics. And when I returned, I got noticed that I received the Best Paper Award. I think there were 17 or 18 presentations, so I was pretty happy with that.
Well, yeah, and again, congratulations on the award. And in terms of the topic, what prompted you to write about this topic? I mean, it's one that I believe a lot of people have interest in, and I know I do personally. When we think about student athletes, especially in the big time sports of football and basketball, and whether or not these players are being treated fairly economically. But what led you to write on this topic in particular?
My students. Yes, my students. Every class, it seems, no matter what I'm teaching, either sports law or sports history or whatever the course may be, we always seem to get into a conversation of should student athletes be paid? And there's always that debate back and forth in the classroom. Some students believe that, they get a scholarship, so that's fair. And some people believe that no, they deserve more because there's a lot of revenue coming in. So this debate happens in every class. So I decided, well, let's figure it out. Let's see if that scholarship is actually fair value for the service that's performed.
Right. And one thing for sure, whether or not athletes are getting paid, that could be a matter of opinion, whether the scholarship is payment or not. But one thing is for sure, the NCAA is getting paid, right? And so Why don't we jump into that a little bit? Because in your paper, you set forth at the very outset some really eye-popping economics as it relates to March Madness and the broadcast rights that the NCAA sells to both CBS and Turner for the right to broadcast March Madness. Can you give us some of the numbers that are associated with that deal?
Sure. The NCAA came to terms with CBS and Turner back in 2010, and at that time it was a $10.8 billion agreement, which gave the NCAA about $770 million annually. So they entered into this long-term contract for $770 million, and then in 2016, a few years ago, they decided to extend it by another 8 years. That extension added another $8.8 billion to the overall contract value. So the average that the NCAA receives just from the men's basketball tournament is approximately $1 billion a year.
Right. $1 billion a year. And you said something important there, Professor. This is just March Madness, right?
This is just the broadcasting rights to March Madness. It doesn't include the ticketing. It doesn't include any of the gate, what we call gate, concessions, parking, merchandise, anything like that. This is just for the broadcasting rights to that tournament.
Okay, so let's start there. So we're talking of roughly, let's call it $1 billion a year. And this agreement runs through 2032, correct?
Exactly.
Okay, so we have this long-term deal, $1 billion a year to broadcast March Madness. But then there's also some other numbers that you have and that I think are important here too, in terms of the number of NCAA Division I men's basketball programs, players, scholarships, and the rest of that. Can you give us a little bit on that as well?
Sure. There are roughly 1,100 colleges and universities that make up the NCAA. They're the member institutions. Out of that 1,100, 351 of those colleges or universities have a D1 men's basketball program. So each program is allowed to offer 13 scholarships, basketball scholarships, men's basketball scholarships, so that there are roughly 4,500 young men who are playing D1 men's basketball.
And in getting to the valuation, and we're going to obviously get to this as we go along, but the average scholarship, I believe you wrote, is somewhere south of $40,000, $38,000 and change, correct?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Some schools are more expensive, so the value of their scholarship is more expensive. Some schools are cheaper. But the average is about $38,000, $39,000. Some schools pay out as much as $45,000. But taking the overall average based on the 351 schools, it's about $38,000, $39,000 per year.
Right. Okay. So the NCAA is bringing in $1 billion a year for March Madness broadcast rights. Average scholarship for Division I men's basketball player, roughly $38,000. Mm-hmm. And that $38,000, I'm going to use the word cap, right? It would represent a cap, right? Isn't it, the amount of money that a student athlete can receive is capped at the value of the scholarship?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. I think that's a fair way to put it. So each student is capped at, 38, 39,000. And then that means this institution, because it can only give 13 scholarships, is capped also. And that's about $500,000.
Wow. Okay. And, Robert, you and I go back a little ways, and I think that I'm not a great fan of the NCAA. I'm just not. And I know the NCAA holds itself out as this guardian of amateur competition, and that sort of undergirds this whole idea of having a cap on what student athletes can receive. But, there are some who, view the NCAA as protecting amateurism, and there's others who view the NCAA as money-making cartel. And I don't know if you want to weigh in on this at all, but you know, and you don't have to, but how does the NCAA even get to this point where they're able to position themselves to get such a huge financial, you know, arrangement with broadcasters, while at the same time holding down the student athletes who are in large part responsible for generating this revenue to such a paltry number in terms of the scholarship value?
Yeah, it's interesting how it happened. I mean, the NCAA was created around 1906, and at that time, they were just a regulatory body, right? They were just there to help with rules, implement rules. So all teams were playing by the same set of rules, basically. But over time, it kind of morphed, and the NCAA went on a power grab, for lack of a better way of putting it, in the 1950s. And at that time, under Walter Byers, the former president, they just seemed to play one institution against another and say, no, we have to do this, we have to implement these rules. And they used the schools against one another to gain all of this leverage. So in the 1950s, they created things like Committee on Infractions, and then they gave themselves the right to sell broadcasting rights. So it was interesting how it happened. It wasn't really given to them. This power was given to them by the member institutions. They kind of just did it.
And it's a beautiful thing if you can get away with it, right? And so that's exactly what's happened here. And so we have the NCAA now positioned to, cut these types of deals. And I don't believe there's anything wrong, and I don't believe you think there's anything wrong with the NCAA making these types of arrangements. But the question is, where do the student athletes, who by and large are responsible for the NCAA being able to cut these types of deals, how are they faring in the process? And I think that's what your paper is dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, the NCAA is the regulatory body. That's fine. I mean, if the member institutions want to give them the NCAA the power to enter into these right deals, that's fine. They have that opportunity to do so. They have the right to do so. But it's what happens to that money and how it is given back to the student athletes is where my concerns are.
Right. Now, in your paper, you run through a very interesting analysis, and you used the 2019 revenue year, for lack of a better term, as a point of reference for the NCAA, because again, you gave us the numbers about $1 billion a year. But if we were to look at 2019 from a revenue standpoint, help us to put that into context as we look to see whether or not these student athletes are getting their fair share. From a revenue standpoint, 2019 for the NCAA, their deal with March Madness, what do those numbers look like?
Sure. So the NCAA is required, CBS is required per their contract to the NCAA to write a check to the NCAA by August 31st of $804 million. So this year's allotment, the 2019 allotment for March Madness, is $804 million. But that's not the end of the story. There's also money that is going into an escrow account. So there's additional monies being paid by CBS Turner to the NCAA. This year, that amount is $75 million. So you got to add the 804 plus the 75 million. Of that 75 million, and this is where it gets really, this is interesting and confusing all at the same time. 67 million is escrowed, but 7.5 million is advanced to the NCAA. So why is there an escrow? My question, we're both lawyers. Why is it going into an escrow account if it's just being advanced anyways? But so that being said, taking those two figures together, that's about $879 million right there, that the CBS and Turner are paying out to the NCAA just for 2019.
And so, right, just for 2019, and again, $879 million.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Now, Professor, you have to understand that doesn't include like overseas broadcasting rights. This is just for domestic.
Right.
So,
And so what happens with this money? I mean, the NCAA, I'm sure, is accountable and has to demonstrate how this money is being distributed, how it's being used. So taking this 879 million figure for 2019, how is that money ultimately being distributed? Where is it going?
well, that's the great question. I mean, I'm doing some research on this and trying to find out where that money actually goes. It looks like the NCAA has 8 various funds that they distribute this money to. Coming into next year, there'll be 9 funds, but for 2019, there's 8 various funds. And in analyzing those funds, it's kind of interesting. One of them is called the Equal Conference Fund, and per the terms of the Equal Conference Fund, it states that the Equal Conference Fund is divided between Division I conferences and not the individual member institutions based on the conference's individual team tournament performance over a 6-year period. Okay? And then there's the Basketball Fund, which is another fund that they distribute money to. And the Basketball Fund, per their rules, is divided between Division I conferences and not the individual member institutions based on the conference's individual team performance over the past 6 years. So I can't figure out what the difference between those two funds is. So they have these funds set up, but they're kind of convoluted and kind of vague about where that money goes. And one of the interesting funds that I recently found out about was this thing called the Special Assistance Fund. And the NCAA allegedly paid $18 million into that fund. But then doing more research, that's just Pell Grant money. That's federal dollars going in to the member institution that the NCAA is taking credit for as a distribution.
Mm.
So you see where it gets a little convoluted and
sure.
crazy? And, yeah.
Sure. Okay, but if we took them at their word, and if we took, you said there are 8 funds, there'll be 9 funds, this year. How much money are we talking about when all is said and done? Again, we're talking 879 million to start with. How much of that is going into these funds?
About 590 million.
590. Okay.
So there's still about 222 million that is not distributed through the funds.
Right. And again, going back to that, I mean, in some ways though, when we talked about the amount that's in escrow, you also mentioned something about a portion of that is advanced to the NCAA, right? So do they get their hands on all 879 or only on the 804 plus the advanced?
They get the 804 plus the advanced. The remaining 67 million is held in escrow until 2025.
Okay, so we're talking maybe around 811 million to start with.
For this year, actually, realized revenue, yes.
Right. Okay, so if we did the math, so that's how you get to your 221 then, right? So they start with 811. They put 590 into these various funds, and it's questionable about what these funds actually are, but they still have an amount remaining of over $220 million.
Exactly. That's not distributed through any of their funds yet.
And that's not distributed anywhere. And then going back, though, to Division I basketball scholarships for men, the total amount, you gave us some numbers. There's 4,500 players who get scholarships. But what's the total amount of money that goes to scholarships? For these
calculating players? It out, roughly 4,500 D1 men's basketball players, 351 schools, 13 scholarships, at the average of about $38,000 a year. It's about $175 million. The member institutions pay out used for men's basketball scholarships.
So then the NCAA, if they wanted to, could foot that bill just based on the amount that's left over from their March Madness contract.
Oh, well, exactly, and still make 45 million.
But they don't. Right? They don't foot the bill. Right? They leave it to the schools to provide the scholarships to these young men, and I guess they pocket the $221.
It's interesting, trying to research where that extra money goes, and speaking to some individuals at the NCAA, they say that money is used to promote and fund other championships in other sports, so tennis, diving, lacrosse. So that money is used to help pay for the championships for those sports that don't generate as much revenue as men's basketball.
Okay.
Do I believe it? That's another question. I haven't done the research on it to find out how much money is actually spent on those various championship tournaments.
Okay, so just again, trying to put these numbers into some context. The NCAA is bringing in $1 billion a year on average. For 2019, $811 million. They dispersed about $590 million. They have $221 million left. The total cost of scholarships for Division I men's basketball players at the various institutions that have D1 programs, $175 million. The NCAA could foot that bill, but they don't. So let's get back to the question that's on the table, though, where what you're most interested in, and that is whether the Division I basketball players, who on average receive $38,000 in scholarships, are they being? Is that their proper value? Take us through now your analysis of that. How do we determine whether or not that $38,000 is an appropriate figure or not?
Well, that was the next step. I mean, so I looked to the various sports organizations out there to see how they distribute their money. So looking at the professional league, and in the professional leagues here in the United States, every league has a player minimum, right? So if you come in as a rookie, you're going to make at least a certain threshold of money per year. That's one thing. And also, there's also a revenue split, a revenue share between the league and the players. In basketball, which I know you're familiar with, there's the BRI, basketball-related income. And that share is roughly 50-50. The basketball players receiving 50%, the owners receiving 50%. And it's similar in the NFL, right? The NFL, the players receive about 48, 49%. The owners receive about 51, 52%. So, but again, that's not just TV revenue. That's all revenue. So,
right.
In analyzing that, I said, well, maybe a fair way to do this would be a revenue share, a minimum and a revenue share. So, analyzing that and looking at the dollar figures, I said, the NCAA brings in totally, with total amount for 2019, $879 million. Well, let's do a revenue share on that at 50%, and that would mean that $440 goes to the NCAA, and the $440 million goes to the players. So, and then that,
you would just like divide that by the number of players, the 45.
And then just dividing that by, Professor, it's that simple. I mean, there's 4,500 players. Taking that $439 million, dividing it by the 4,500 players, comes out roughly to about $98,000 per year per student.
And based on that, is that what you believe is, I'm going to call it the fair value, and I'm putting air quotes up, the fair value of a Division I men's basketball player?
That's the minimum amount that they should receive. Is that fair value? I don't know if it's fair value, but I know it's the minimum amount they should receive based on March Madness. revenue
based
for money.
and again, and this is what's incredible, Professor Romano, and we're just talking March Madness.
Yes.
We're not talking regular season, and we're just talking broadcast rights, right? We're not talking licensing, ticket sales, or any other related revenue.
No, we're not talking NIT revenue. We're not talking in-season broadcasting rights. Any of that other those other revenue generators. This is just that 16 days of March Madness.
Okay, so I'm going to round up and say it's $98,000, the quote unquote fair value. And going back to the average value of a scholarship being $38,000, that puts us in the realm of a $60,000 surplus.
Exactly.
So if we were to have this type of a system where, as you described, a revenue split, NCAA gets half, players get half, players get their pro rata share, it's $98,000. But what would happen with the excess money, right? The $60,000 per year, given that, the cost of attending on average is $38,000. Where does that, how's that $60,000 going to be handled?
Well, what I think should be done with that money is that it should go into a trust account for that individual athlete. So that $60,000 is in a trust account. It builds up over the 4 years that they're in college. So when they graduate, there's a fund for them. So if they decide at that time they want to continue with their education, they want to go to medical school, or they'd like to go to law school, there's a fund there that they can tap into that will help pay for this cost. Or if they do not want to go and continue with their education, maybe there's a fund for them to start a business or to invest in somebody else's business. But that money is there for them. It is escrowed, trusted for them for the 4 years, and then it's available to them once they graduate.
Now, what would you say to those who say, wait a minute, Professor, this all sounds well and good, but these are student athletes with the emphasis on being a student first. And we shouldn't be engaging in these types of conversations. They're able to attend institutions of higher education. Some of them actually do earn their degrees, even though the top players in basketball typically are one and done. But nevertheless, we should not be having these types of conversations. We're not talking about professional athletes. We're talking about student athletes. What would be your response to that?
Yes, they are student athletes, but they are generating a huge amount of revenue. And because their skills and their abilities are allowing the NCAA to capitalize, that money should also be used for them to capitalize on their skills and on their talents. And you know what? Why not let them continue with their education? If you're really concerned about the student athlete and they want to continue and they want to graduate and they want to go on to postgraduate studies, well, there should be money there for them to allow them to do that.
Right, because on the one hand, especially with basketball, right, because we have this phenomenon of one and done right now, the idea that we're talking about students and, for the very best players, everyone knows what's going on, right? They're going there for a year and then they're entering into the draft. And some are going to make it and others aren't. And then what? And it might not be a safety net for those players who end up not making it. What about, though, every now and then we have one of those special players. This year we had, right, Zion Williamson. Is this a one size fits all, or is there something that should be done? Because Zion Williamson alone, I mean, he was an industry unto himself while at Duke. His games, the ticket prices for his games, the TV viewership, and everything else, the numbers supported, right, was just extraordinary. It was above and beyond what would typically be the case. How would a player like that, who can demonstrate that he has a different effect on revenue, how should that player be treated? Is he just one of the 4,500 players who's treated exactly the same?
Yes and no. Yes, with regards to the fact that he's going to get that $98,000, right? But that's why I call it the minimum amount. So for a special talent like Zion, I mean, they'd be able to capitalize to the next level and maybe receive revenue from merchandise sales. So if Duke or the NCAA sells a jersey with his number on it, well, he gets a piece of that. If they sell whatever, a bobblehead or whatever with his logo or his image on it, he gets a piece of that. And, with regards to the increased ticket sales, I think, there's many smart people at Duke. They can come up with a formula to say, hey, Zion's impact is this amount. So therefore, because of that impact, he gets a piece equal to this amount. So, like I said, that $98,000 a year threshold is just the minimum salary. Special players will get to capitalize at that next level through merchandising, increased ticket revenue, and so forth.
Now, going back to something though, Professor, if the NCAA shared the revenue with the players, would that have a negative effect on some of the other sports? Because you did mention some of these funds where the NCAA, distributes some money into each one of these funds. Presumably, you seem to have some doubt of whether or not it's really affecting, some of the lower tier sports. But would there be some kind of drop off in terms of some other athletic opportunities at schools because 50% of this money is going to the men's basketball players?
No, it may actually help. If you think about it, if the NCAA takes over for paying that $500,000 a year for men's basketball scholarships, that means that member institution has an extra $500,000 per year to spend. And therefore, they could spend it on women's sports. They could spend it on, bringing wrestling back. I mean, that was a big thing we heard years ago for the Title IX effect. We're losing wrestling. But they can redistribute that money into other sports and promote those sports. And that's the first part. And secondly, I think the NCAA relies too much on the cash cow of men's basketball and doesn't promote the other non-revenue generating sports as much. And they're not looking at the business and the revenue that they can generate off of those sports as well. So, I mean, the NCAA sits back, collects all this money from men's basketball, and really doesn't work or look to generate revenue from those other sports the way they could or the way they can.
Now, as we mentioned at the top, your paper won an award, and so obviously it's been well received. But I wonder, given that you have those in academia who have different viewpoints, have you received any pushback from any of your peers who believe that the premise and the idea of paying these athletes is something that we should not entertain?
Yeah, I think the initial pushback is exactly that. They're student athletes, so why should they receive more value than that of a scholarship? But then when you sit down and you break it down for them and show them the actual amounts and the actual figures, they're like, oh, I get it. I see that it's not fair compensation. So, I mean, initially, yes, especially at this conference, I did get a lot of pushback right from the beginning and when I was presenting it. And I got a lot of questions and a lot of snide remarks, let's say. And then, as I progressed through it and showed them the details and showed them the amount of money that is generated, they're like, oh, maybe this isn't as, black and white as we thought it was.
And it's interesting, Professor, because I believe the question is always aimed toward the student athletes. Why should they earn money, or why should they be compensated above the value of a scholarship? But the flip side of that coin, the question doesn't ever seem to be asked. Meaning, why aren't we asking why should the NCAA be sort of the primary, if not sole, beneficiary of this revenue that's being generated on the backs of players.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's exactly the way. Why is the NCAA making all this money, and why isn't it being redistributed and put into enhancements for those student athletes the way it could develop them for the long run, beyond their basketball careers.
Right. And we've been talking just about basketball, and you used the phrase a little while ago, the cash cow of men's basketball, but the cash cow has a twin, right? And that twin is big time football, right? Do you see the football program somehow, the Division I football programs, should the players there be treated the same way, or is that somehow different?
I think it's very similar, and actually that's the next paper that I'm working on now, coming up with what is the value of a D1 football player. What are the revenue streams? How much money is generated from D1 football? Then analyzing that, how many scholarships are given. And you got to understand there's a lot more scholarships in football than there are in basketball. But just working those figures now, and hopefully by next summer, by the next Global Business Research Symposium, I'll have that answer.
Okay. One question I do have for you is there are a number of people who agree with you, right? We talked about those who may have some questions and maybe say, no, we shouldn't do this. We're talking student athletes and all the rest of it. But there are a fair number of people who agree with you and agree with you in terms of your premise as to student athletes getting a fairer share of the revenue that they help to generate. But the question I have for you is this something, do you consider this more something that's scholarly and intellectually interesting, or are you seeking somehow to take it beyond just an academic exercise and discourse and maybe try to affect change?
Well, I want to take it beyond. Definitely want to take it beyond. I've always been an advocate for athletes' rights, for the athletes themselves, and I think the student athletes have been beaten up long enough, for lack of a better way of putting it. I mean, they've been taken advantage of long enough, and it's time for the institution to change. It's difficult. It's a big ship, and big ships are tough to steer, and so it's tough to turn around, especially when the member institutions that are making a lot of money off this program have the most control over the NCAA. So, but no, I want to take this to the next level. I would like to see something happen along these lines.
Well, as I said, I mean, and look, anything I can do to be of help, just let me know, because you know how I feel about the NCAA, but also more importantly about players and being a player advocate, and that includes the student athletes as well. But Rob,
well, this is a great way. This is a great way. I mean, this is perfect. I mean, getting the word out there, thank you for doing this, with your podcast, getting the word out there, getting people, creating awareness about these issues. This is the first step and a long step, but it can help down the road.
Sure. And look, hats off to you for writing it. And again, congratulations on the award. Now, if there are people out there listening to this who would like to find out more, maybe read your paper. You mentioned to me that there's going to be a shorter version of your paper coming out in the Sports Business Journal. Why don't you tell us about that? If people are interested in reading the paper, how can they go about getting their hands on it?
Sure. They can always contact me directly. My email is Romano r1@stjohns.edu. Please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to share the paper or anything else with you. And on August 26th, a shorter version, just a recap or an overview of this paper will be in the Sports Business Journal. So, and then I'll have my contact information through that article as well.
Okay, that's great. And as we're recording this, I mean, today is August 21st. So on August 26th, Sports Business Journal, a condensed version of the article will be published. So that's great that those who are interested can get their hands on that, and then obviously have an opportunity to reach out to you if they want more information or the complete paper. So, but Professor Romano, let me tell you, man, I'm with you. I'm with you. I believe that Division I men's basketball players, football players, should be compensated. And to me, it's really a simple calculus. If you are playing a significant role in generating revenue, you should share in the revenue that you generate.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Well, maybe we'll get there one day. Maybe we'll get there. Well, listen, this has been a great conversation. I really appreciate, you taking the time today to talk through this with us. And as I said, really, if there's anything I can do to be helpful going forward, let me know. But thanks for coming on and talking about the paper and this topic, because it really is timely. It really is something that I believe is important, and hopefully we can see some change in this area.
I appreciate it, Dan. Thank you, Professor. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you.